Hello, all of my history-loving friends. Welcome back. I'm so glad to be back. I apologize I missed a week because I got COVID for the first time in 2 years. I managed to avoid it for quite a while. If you like what you see here, please like this video. Please subscribe to my channel. This is a history channel where we talk about historical topics that tend to have a bit of a darker side. Not always. Like the channel and tell all your friends. This episode is a continuation of my last episode about the real Molly Brown, who was never called Molly in her lifetime. That was made up for the 1960s musical because Margaret doesn't roll off the tongue when you're singing. Today's episode is all about her time on Titanic and her survivor story. There will also be a third part that will begin on board Carpathia and finish the rest of the real Molly Brown's life. Where we left off, Margaret was on a trip with her daughter Helen. Margaret had been traveling all over with John Jacob Astor, his wife Madeleine, and their party. They'd been to Cairo, they'd been to Rome, and she was in Paris when she got a telegram from her son, Lawrence, who was an adult, who was married, and had an infant son, Lawrence Jr., who was sick. So she changed her plans immediately and booked passage back to the United States with John Jacob Astor and his wife, even though originally she had planned to stay behind. Now let's get started right where we left off. Maggie got on board at Cherbourg, France. Titanic was so big, it could not come into the berth. So there were two smaller vessels, the RMS Nomadic and the RMS Traffic, that ferried passengers out to Titanic from the shore. According to Margaret, it was a very dreary, rainy day. The seas were so rough, people were getting ill. They had to wait because Titanic was late. Titanic almost struck another vessel when leaving Southampton. The suction was so great from Titanic, it pulled two other vessels, broke their moorings, and it almost collided. Just at the last minute, Captain Smith reversed the engines, which created a wash that pushed them away from Titanic. They missed it by inches. She spent some time talking with a Mrs. Bucknell from Philadelphia, who was a very good friend of hers. Mrs. Bucknell was a widow. Her husband had founded Bucknell University in Philadelphia. She was traveling with her maid. Margaret was traveling alone, which was extremely unusual for that day and time. Women, it was just not considered proper for a woman to travel by herself. But Margaret, being Margaret, really didn't care what anybody thought. She was speaking with Mrs. Bucknell, and Mrs. Bucknell made the remark, "I just don't feel right about this. I have foreboding in my heart about this ship and getting on it. I feel like something bad is going to happen." And that is not a direct quote. I'm totally paraphrasing there. And Margaret told her she was just being silly. "Don't worry about it. You're just nervous. You're just anxious to get home. Everything will be fine. This is the most modern ship you could possibly want to be on." They finally get there. Dinner is a few hours later, and she said it was a very pleasant voyage. Titanic was known for being very gentle, hardly any vibration. There was always just that steady throbbing of the engines that gave people a lot of peace as it sailed along. She spent a lot of her time reading. She went to the ladies' writing room a lot. The library apparently was her favorite room. She also spent a lot of time in the gymnasium. She was friendly with T.W. Macaulay, who was the instructor for the gymnasium. She did a lot of exercising in there. On the electric camel, he would show her the various devices that women could ride while wearing things women wore then. I can't imagine working out in something like that. She was really getting upset about her weight at the time, and she had cut a lot of things out of her diet. Of course, when you're traveling, you gain weight. It just happens. So she had cut out things like butter and sugar, coffee, cream, and she had lost a little bit. She'd lost about 5 pounds. She would take long walks along the deck, just taking in the view and the sea air. The day of the disaster was a Sunday, April 14th, 1912. There was church service that morning. She said fully half of the passengers, first and second class, attended. As the day progressed, she said it got extremely cold, as in the cold would just creep in every crevice of the ship. Her room, all of the first class rooms, had these little cabin heaters, and she said she could not imagine how people who did not have these heaters could get through it. It was just that cold. And as I said in my last episode, Second Officer Lightoller compared it to the below the zero of Canada, the temperature that night. She had stretched out in bed. It was after 11. She was reading. Now she says something happens here that could not have happened. She claims that when they hit the iceberg, that she was thrown to the floor out of her bed. There is no way this happened. Even men down where the actual collision occurred were not knocked off of their feet. And Lightoller described it, he would have been a few decks above her in the officers' quarters, but he described it as more of an interruption of the smoothness of the throb of those engines. She said she got up and looked into the hallway to see what was going on. And there were a lot of other people standing in the hallway, milling around, asking each other what was going on. There were some men at a room, it was a room across the hall and down the hall just a little bit, who were in their pajamas, and one took his elbow and jostled the other guy and said, "Are you ready to swim in those things?" Just making a joke. No one seemed to be taking it too seriously, so she went back into her room and started reading again. As she's sitting there reading, she hears somebody say they were going to go up on deck and see what was happening. She peers out into the hallway again just to see what's going on. And when she does this, she sees an officer and a couple of sailors working on something in the floor. There was a little plate in the floor that they had an auger of some sort or a wrench, and they were trying to turn this wrench. It looked like they were having some trouble, but they were joking about it and didn't seem to worry about it too much. The reason I think she was on D-deck is because these plates were in the floor on D-deck, and what they did was, that was where they would manually lower the watertight doors. Not all watertight doors were activated by flipping a switch. Some had to be manually lowered. Whether they ever got these doors down, I don't know, because they appear to be having trouble, according to her. Again, she went back in her room and laid down. A little while later, someone knocks on her door. She answers it, and she says he looks very haggard. He's breathing hard, probably because he's gone up the steps to deck E and come all the way back down. And he was known as a pretty big guy. His name was James McGow. He was a buyer for Gimbel Brothers. He was from Philadelphia, and he was traveling with 3 other businessmen, and they were sharing 2 adjoined staterooms. He says his room was on the starboard side, deck E. He was sharing his room with Mr. Flynn, a buyer for Gimbel Brothers, New York. They left their stateroom. They met dining room steward, Mr. Dodd. They asked him, "Is there any danger?" Mr. Dodd replied, "Not in the least," and he suggested they go back to bed. Mr. Flynn and Mr. McGow do not do this. They decided they were going to go up to the promenade deck, but before he did this, he rapped on the door of the stateroom opposite mine, which was occupied by a lady. We suggested to her that she had better get up at once and dress, as there was apparently something wrong. Maggie describes a man knocking on her door and telling her she needed to go to the boat deck, and she listens at once. I told you that it was odd for a woman to travel alone, and yet he specifically points out that the lady in the stateroom across from him was by herself. She runs into McGow on board Carpathia to find that he has survived. All 4 of the gentlemen in that room survived because they went up immediately and got in lifeboats when nobody else would. And she says his name. She spells it slightly wrong, and I believe she says Kimball instead of Gimbel Brothers, but she's clearly talking about him. So her room had to have been on E-deck. Between her story matching up with McGow's and seeing the sailors working on the floor, she had to have been on E-deck. After talking to McGow, Margaret puts on every pair of stockings she has with her. It's at least 7 pairs. She then finds the warmest dress she has. It is a black and white dress. She puts a black silk capote, a hat, on her head, and she drapes herself in her furs. She put $500 in a money belt. She also kept a little 3-inch shabti she had gotten in Cairo. And she kept that as a good luck charm. She said she knew other people would probably need life belts, so she grabbed everything that was in her room. There were 4 of them. She says she had to reach up to get them, and that's because they were located on top of the wardrobe in her room. And then she went to the boat deck. Upon arriving at the boat deck, she said there were about 50 people there, milling around, putting on their life vests, waiting to be told what to do. She ran into Mrs. Bucknell, who told her, "I told you something would happen." I don't know how Margaret replied to that because she didn't say. She ran into a Madame Duvalier from Paris, who was panicking a little bit. She was not dressed appropriately. She was just in her dressing gown. She had nothing on her legs. She just had on some skimpy slippers. And she's talking about how she needs to go back to her cabin and get her money and her jewels. Margaret tells her, "Do not do that. Everything will be okay. The steward will lock your room. We'll be back on board before you know it. Just get in the boat and everything will be okay." Madame Duvalier was actually a 24-year-old young woman from Brussels named Bertha Antonine Maine. She had been a cabaret singer in Paris. She became lovers with a young man from Canada named Quig Baxter. He talked her into coming with him back to Montreal. In order to hide her identity, he gave her her own stateroom in first class, and she traveled under an assumed name, Madame Duvalier. She had previously had a relationship with a soldier named Duvalier. Villiers? Madame de Villiers. It may be Villiers. Madame de Villiers. When she realized that Baxter could not get in the boat with her, she panicked. And this is when she wanted to go back to her room. She wanted to get her things, and Maggie was able to talk her out of doing this. Baxter put her in lifeboat 6 along with his mother and his sister, and he went down with the ship. She got to Canada and she stayed in Montreal for a while with Baxter's family before returning, beginning her singing career again. She never married, and later in her life, she tried to tell her family she had been on board Titanic, and no one believed her. It was only after she died and they found a scrapbook and clippings and photographs that proved she had been on Titanic. She was on the port side of the ship, or the left side of the ship, where all of the boats were being lowered by Second Officer Lightoller, who we talked about last week. He loaded lifeboat 6, which had Margaret in it. Maggie had no intention of getting in the lifeboat. She said she saw that her friends were all put in the boat. She was turning around to go to the other side of the ship to see if there was anything she could do, or just to see what was going on over there, when she was grabbed from behind, and she says an officer dropped her fully 4 feet in the boat after saying, "You are going too." At the last moment, one of the sailors got out because Officer Lightoller said he needed somebody to operate the falls. Falls was the ropes lowering the lifeboats. That sailor got out. His name was Hemmings, and he took over, and they were lowering the boat. They had it halfway to the water when people began complaining that there was only one sailor in the boat. There actually were 2. Frederick Fleet was in the boat. He had been in the lookout. He had seen the iceberg. And it sounds like he was so quiet and so huddled up and so horrified about what had happened and what he had seen. And who knows what was going on in his head at the time, whether it was his fault, I don't know. But people seem to have not noticed that he was even there. And he does not say a word for hours. The other sailor in the boat is Robert Hitchens. He took over at the tiller and he refused to leave that spot. When they hollered up asking for another sailor to get in, Lightoller couldn't find any because he had sent 7 of them away to open gangway doors, where he had this idea that he would fully load the boats from those doorways deeper in the ship. None of the boats he lowered actually went to those doors. The sailors he sent away disappeared. The doors were never opened. It didn't work out. But they were halfway to the water, so he asked for a volunteer. He said, "Is anybody here a sailor?" A first-class passenger named Arthur Puchin raised his hand and said, "Sir, I am not a sailor, but I am a yachtsman." And he pointed to a pen he was wearing that showed that he was a an accomplished yachtsman. In the dark, the lights on Titanic would have been very dim. No one would have been able to see the pen. But he told him, if you can climb out on that davit and go down those falls to this boat that's halfway launched, you can go. And Hitchens did just that. He was a military man. He was from Canada. There is some debate as to how much good Hitchens does in the boat that night, because things are going to get heated is probably not, well, things do get heated. The behavior of Robert Hitchens was questioned by many people in Boat 6, including Margaret. The way the lifeboats lowered, there were 2 sets of ropes, and they had to be lowered simultaneously, or the boat would not be level as it went down. This happened on Lifeboat 6, and one side was going faster than the other so that the boat tipped. So they were yelling back up, stop on this side, till it got even again. And as they were going down, Maggie says she saw water bursting out of one of the portholes below them. She says she grabbed an oar. She took that oar and she pushed it against the side of Titanic to push the boat away so that water wouldn't go into their boat. They got past that. They finally got to the sea and began rowing away toward a light they could see in the distance that clearly was another ship. Almost immediately, Hitchens starts being a real pain. According to Maggie, he was an extremely negative person. He began telling everybody that they were all going to die. He told them they needed to row, and they needed to row fast and get away from Titanic. But he refused to help row himself. He loved to tell other people what they were doing wrong as they rowed. Some women told him that he needed to take over rowing. You need to row, let me do the tiller. He absolutely refused to give that up. I know Hitchens offered to take over the tiller for a while so that he could row and stay warm. He just would not do it. He told them that there was no way they could get far enough away from Titanic because no matter what, she was sinking and the suction was going to be so great that they would all be sucked down into the ocean and drowned. He said the Titanic would break apart the icebergs and that even if they survived the suction, the icebergs were going to come and sink them and they were all going to be lost. He said that they were not going to be rescued by anybody. There's no food, no water, no compass in the boat. He became obsessed with the notion that the plug in the bottom of the boat was not functioning properly and that they were going to take on water and sink. And mostly, Margaret said they tried to just ignore him. They just kept rowing. Margaret said, we're all just going to have to row. The ladies, we're going to have to save ourselves. And if they ever stopped, they were so frozen, they just could not stop moving. Margaret shared all of the stockings she was wearing. She began to take some of them off and hand them out to people who were not dressed warmly enough. One of the ladies had a flask, and Hitchens decided that he wanted a drink. Hitchens said, you're not rowing, you don't need it. Lila Meyer owned the flask, and she said, if I give you this, you're just going to drink it all. So she put a blanket around his shoulders, someone else put a blanket around his waist. They said, here, now you've got more blankets than we do. I mean, they couldn't stand this guy. Margaret says that the young woman sitting next to her rode like a galley slave. Margaret talks about how the lights were still on Titanic. She also said she could hear the band playing. She said she paid particular attention to the promenade deck, watching for people as it was lit up. She says she didn't see anybody. And when she describes the musicians stopping playing, she says that it was as if they played until they could play no more, as if their instruments filled up with water. She does not mention what song she believes they were playing last. Margaret doesn't describe the sinking as specifically as Lightoller did. There were things about the sinking that she never talked about the rest of her life, but what she would have seen is the stern gradually rising out of the water. there would have been a tremendous noise, as everything not attached would have gone roaring across rooms, busting through walls, depending on how heavy it was. The sound of furniture crashing, china breaking, the boilers coming loose. The noise, I'm sure, would have been unbelievable. It would have been lit, and then it suddenly would have gone dark as the electricity went out. She does not report whether she saw it break in half, but we all know that it did, and I'm sure the sound of that would have been unbelievable. Here is how she describes the sinking exactly. Quote, "Suddenly there was a rift in the water. The sea opened up and the surface foamed like giant arms that spread around the ship." And then she was gone. She says afterwards she didn't hear anything. And I can't imagine that that can possibly be true. Everybody who talks about Titanic talks about the sound of all of those people in the water. I mentioned last time how Frankie Goldsmith, a 9-year-old at the time, described it sounded like a baseball stadium when someone hits a home run and everybody starts screaming. Every time that happened, he lived near a stadium. It just took him right back. And I think of it today. I think of him describing that way when I hear that sound in a stadium. And from what I've heard from her family, it seems that that was one aspect of it she would never talk about because it was just too awful to comprehend. Many of the women in Lifeboat 6 wanted to go save more people. There were 24 people in their boat and it could hold 65. Almost every woman in that boat had someone in the water. Fathers, husbands, brothers, sons. And some of them were actually saying their names. And they said, we have to go back. We can get people, we can put a lot of people in this boat. And Hitchens just absolutely would not allow them to do that. For the next 2 hours, they rowed just to keep warm. There was no destination in sight, just the stars, icebergs, and the water. They had no idea how many boats were in the water. They couldn't see any of them. Every now and then there would be a flash, like someone in one of the boats had lit a light or a flare, but then it would go out. Margaret was miserable. There was some water in the boat, so she was wet from the feet up to her ankles, but she was also drenched in sweat at the upper part of her torso. If she ever stopped rowing for a moment, she knew she would freeze to death. They all would. Hitchens was not helping matters. He kept telling them that they weren't going to make it, that they were either going to sink or starve or freeze to death. Margaret finally said, just be quiet. Keep it to yourself if you feel that way. The seas are calm. We're rowing. It's a gentle night. We've got a fighting chance. Everyone kept telling him, why don't you row? Keep yourself warm. But all he wanted to do was just keep telling people what to do and to tell them how they were doing it wrong. He said, I don't even know which direction we're rowing. Helen Candy pointed to the sky and said, that's the North Star. We're rowing north, sir. Another hour and a half passed. Everyone was so cold. If they stopped rowing for even a moment, they feared freezing to death. But as dawn broke, they saw another lifeboat. It was Lifeboat 16, and it was quite full. At the bow of this ship was a man in white pajamas. Margaret told him that unless he started rowing, he was going to freeze to death. He better get his circulation going. Hitchens ordered that they tie up to the second boat. His order was obeyed, and they all rested for a moment. But the longer they sat there, the more frozen they became. Also in that boat was a stoker, and he was wearing hardly anything. He was covered in coal dust. His legs were bare from the knees down. He transferred into their boat so that they would have more men. As soon as he did so, Margaret took off her sable stole and she wrapped it around his legs from the knees down and tied it around his ankles. The women started to get restless as they got more and more cold. They wanted to start rowing again. Julia Cavendish said, "We need to row. We need to get moving." Helen Candy also voiced the opinion that they needed to untie and get moving. Margaret said, "Untie us from this boat." And Hitchens just became enraged. He told Margaret that she needed to mind her business, to let him command this boat, to stay in her place. And the stoker, who she had just put the furs around, said, "Hey, don't you know you're talking to a lady?" And Hitchens replied, "I know who I'm talking to. I'm in charge of this boat." As the people in Lifeboat 16 begin doing what Margaret has said to untie them from their boat, Hitchens just howls with rage. And Margaret says, "If you try to stop me, I will throw you overboard." She said some of the other ladies in the boat acted as if they were going to hold her back, but she said, "All I would have had to have done is take a step toward him and he would have fallen out of the boat on his own." He was so terrified. He was so freaked out. He was shivering uncontrollably because he was so cold. But they listened to Margaret. The boat was untied and the ladies began rowing again. I'm sure Margaret was boiling on the inside, and she just used that energy to row harder and faster. The women would talk to each other. They might sing a little bit to keep themselves moving, to keep going. They were so exhausted. Every now and then they would spell each other to give their arms and bodies a break, only to find that once they stopped moving, they got so cold they could hardly bear it. One of the girls in the boat, she had a very pretty English accent, according to Margaret, cried, "There's a light!" They could see a light in the distance. And Hitchens just said, "It's just a shooting star. It's nothing." But some of the other people in the boat started to say, no, I think that's a ship." And for the first time all night, Frederick Fleet spoke. And some people were so unaware he had even been there that it startled them to hear him say anything. He said, "I bet that's the Carpathia." And sure enough, it was, but it seemed still so far away. And Margaret said that even all night, now that they finally had a destination, the time between seeing Carpathia and reaching her was the most miserable, the longest part of the night, because it felt like they would never get there. When they finally did, the seas had gotten much rougher and there was more wind. Several times they would almost get to Carpathia, and then it was like they would just bounce right off the hull and have to row back again. It took 3 or 4 tries to finally get hold of Carpathia and to start unloading people. They lowered a swing because for most of the people, their hands were so cold, they did not function well enough to climb a ladder. So people would be placed in this swing and pulled up on board. And as soon as they got on board, they were offered a warm drink, like hot coffee. They put blankets around their shoulders, and they found a place for them to get warm. We're going to stop here as they are picked up by the Carpathia, and the next episode is going to go into what happens on Carpathia, how Margaret jumps into action to begin to help people who survived this, and the rest of her life will be covered in the next episode. Thank you so much for joining me. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to my channel. I would love to have you. We're going to have lots more stories like this. I'll see you next time.